Alright, welcome to another episode of Tyflow. So in last Tyflow tutorials, we talked a bit about the modifiers, type modifiers. Try them and they're genuinely really good. Now we are ready to get into the particle world. So as we mentioned in the installation tutorials, Tyflow initially is trying to replace the old particle system within 3ds Max particle flow system. And the particle system has been there for ages, but unfortunately it hasn't been upgraded or updated for years. So they're pretty old, they're powerful, but it got limitations. So that's why we have Tyflow. And if you want to find the old particle system, it's under the creation panel. Alright, under geometries you'll find the particle system, and you can drag a icon there. You see there's particles generated from that little icon. Alright, so now today we're not going to talk about the old particle system. Let's just directly start with the new particle system. Now let's back to the standard, and here you will find the particle icon. Alright, so just to select that and drag an icon in your viewport. Nothing gonna happen because that just basically tell the scenarios we just create a particle. It's a bit different from the old particle system. When you drag the icon, it will automatically generate the particles for you. But for our particle system, we're gonna do both by ourselves. Alright, so after that, let's go to the modify panel. So that's the modify panel for the Tyflow. Before we get into the editor, it's closed. That's the particle programming we're gonna do. That's the Tyflow code editor. Before we get into the details of that, there's a couple of things I do want to mention to you about these Tyflow settings. So here, under the settings, the one of them is very important is the time steps. Basically, these time steps tells the Tyflow how accurate do you want to have your simulation on. So normally the default setting was set to frame, so basically means it will simulate your simulations based on a frame basis, and sometimes it's not enough, especially if you're doing some cloth simulations. If you check the following tutorials, you will find there's especially the inflatable architecture one. That's another type of the cloth simulation, but you will find if you set the frames time step just by the frame, that's not enough. You will have the cloth clashed with other geometries, so that basically means you don't have enough accuracy on your simulation. So in that case, what you need to do is just set the frames to a lower number. So it would take longer time to simulate the scenarios, but it will give you a better result. Now let's just set to the frame first. The other one worth to mention is the physics. So sometimes when you do the physics simulations with Tyflow, if you don't want to have a gravity, the default setting of the Tyflow, it will set a gravity. So basically, if you have a particles in the air, and it will drop down as it is on the earth, or it has a gravity. So that's the gravity values, default gravity, world gravity value set up here. If you untick that will give basically you're in the space, there's no gravity at all. And if you set to positive number, the gravity gonna go to opposite direction. And the ground collider is another one worth to be aware, is basically treating your scenarios as a ground. So when you're trying to simulate a ball falling from the scenarios, it will hit on the ground and bouncing up. So that's because we have a ground collider. If you untick that will just directly fall infinity. Alright, so that's something you need to know before we get into the editor. And there's other things which is a bit more advanced. When we get into more advanced simulations, we'll talk about them. Alright, so let's start with the Tyflow. So to start with the Tyflow, you will find there are different operators here, which is in different color. So the burst of the particles, you could have different tab as well. Alright, to tell you what are those particles. You'll have the burst particles, basically tell you burst the particles, as its name. Spiral particles, you have delay, you have standard operators, there's position your object, speed, and stop. Those controllers of your particles have data control, and control the material, you could control the shape. So there are lots of them, don't worry, let's just start from some examples. If you right click here under the preset flow, you will find there are some preset flows here. Let's select the simple object one. Alright, now we have something happened in the viewport. So if you now drag your timeline, you will see that's that flow generated. So what we have here, let's have a close look. So for all of the particles, you're gonna have a burst first. So under the burst, basically tell you how many particles you want. So the burst, you can set up the first frame, and you can set up the end frame, start frame, and how many that's the total particles you want to generate. You could generate based on the frame as well. For example, every frame, let's generate 10. So basically every frame, so you're gonna generate 10. Alright, so the second one is telling is trying to tell where is the particle. So it create a position object and using the object to control it. The third one is speed, tell where how fast the particle is gonna go and which is direction. Now the direction is set up to the random 3D, so that's why it goes everywhere. We can set up, like for example, if you do random horizontal, that will just go in a horizontal way. Alright, the third one is a shape. So this is the operator tell what kind of the shape you want to use the particle. It just currently is just using a 3D default shape. You can find there's a 2D shapes here, there's 3D shapes here, there's a bunch of 3D shapes you could play with. Alright, to generate faster, and you could use your own shape. For example, let's bring up my favorite teapot. Alright, not you. Yeah, so I can use a reference node to reference my teapot, but like you see, there's nothing happened yet. It's not successfully referenced. Alright, and I don't want to rescale that, stay as 100. Alright, and then we use the teapot to replace the cubes I have. Alright, and I have a mesh. You need to have a mesh to make your scenarios be able to render. So have a mesh, then to display under. Sometimes you will find, where is my geometry? It's already assigned the shapes. I have the mesh, but I can't see them. That's just because your display was set to other modes. So what you need to do is just set to the geometry, and then you'll be able to see those. Alright, and this is called one flow. You could turn them on and off. Alright, and you could have a different flow, Tyflow, in different settings, or you can have two flows in the same settings. For example, let's have another one. Let's have a physical flow. Alright, so you can see that physical flow, it generates the points, right? From 0 frame to 100 frame, and there's 50 particles has been generated from that flow. Then it has a position icon that is called a position icon to place. Let's hide all of them. If you click on the front of them, that basically means you enable that specific operator. Let's enable the display first. they'll be able to see those particles. Right, you can see those particles are placed on the icons. And if you want to create your own icons, you could find that on the create. All right, I think it's on the helper. Find your Tyflow. There's position Tyflow icons. All right, and we could create our own icons. And let's go back to our modify panel. Tyflow editor. So that's how we control where we have the particles. And then it added a shape. Go back, change back to geometries to those particles. So then they become the cubes. All right. And then in this flow, it added physics. So make those boxes becomes real boxes, has some physics onto that. So that's why the box is gonna falling down. All right, and has a mesh on top of that, so make those your particles be able to render. So that's basically the logic behind the Tyflows. So you normally just have a bus. You tell where you want to have those particles on, and you have a shape. So make your particles just instead of just the particles, but have some shape geometries around that. If you want to have physics on that, you could add the physics shapes on top of that. If you just don't have that, and you have a mesh to make the whole scenarios renderable. Alright, so that's the basic of the Tyflow. I will see you in another episode.